This is Cheryl Manley from Sharing Love of Paper. I'm so glad you could join me for another card making class today. Today continues our look at elements of design. We're going to be using the trusty tools, stamps, and dies as we make some masculine cards and talk about visual weight and balance, perspective, and number of elements. I'll bring in the pieces for the first card. As you can see, I've made most of the elements ahead of time so you can see what needs to be done without watching me stamp and die cut stuff. I've taken a piece of crumb cake cardstock and I've used this die a couple of times to create this pegboard for my tools. I'm using paper from Woven Textures. The paper is no longer available, but you can use whatever you have or get something similar from the Need for Tweed set that is currently on last chance sale. I backed my pegboard with pecan pie cardstock. I stamped my sentiment, from the same Trusty Tools stamp set, in the middle of the patterned paper piece that I had already cut to 4 by 5 1/4. I used a die from Changing Leaves die set that's no longer available, but you can use whatever die you have or cut it with your paper trimmer to a rectangular shape. I took a piece of pecan pie cardstock that was 4 1/8 by 5 3/8 and gutted the center, just using my paper trimmer to trim a 1/4 piece all around the edge. What I was left with was what I'm using to back my pegboard, though I trimmed it to fit. For the tools, I used both the Trusty Tools stamps and the Trusty Tools dies. Even though I store them together, they are purchased separately. Here are the 2 stamps I used for the adjustable wrench and the hammer. I stamped the hammer twice, once on real red cardstock and once on a piece of silver foil sheet. Note that because the silver foil is such a slick surface, you really need to stamp it with StazOn ink. Other inks will just rub off. Also note that you may need a special StazOn stamp cleaner to clean your stamp, which you'll want to do right away, and then clean your stamp again with dish soap and water, rinsing thoroughly to remove all residue. Then I used the matching cutting dies to cut them out. This other wrench doesn't have a stamp, it's just die cut. I don't know if you can see the little pieces I added to hold the tools to my pegboard. These tools are just loose except for that. I just trimmed a 1/16 piece of smoky slate cardstock and threaded it through the holes. I'm using smoky slate cardstock for the next card, so I just grabbed a sliver from that. This piece is for the inside of the card. I'll go ahead and glue these pieces in place while I talk a bit about visual weight and balance. Your eye and brain assign weight to what they see. For example, darker colors will have more visual weight than lighter ones, and elements on your card will each have visual weight, with larger ones having more weight. Symmetry is the easiest way to balance a card. You can have balance with asymmetry, but that's definitely more challenging to make sure it's still balanced. Symmetry can be mirror images on the 2 sides of your card, but it doesn't have to be. On this first card, the wrenches are not identical, but they are similar enough that the design feels symmetrical. The sentiment was stamped in real red ink using a stamp from the Trusty Tools stamp set, and after I die cut the piece, I inked the edges with pecan pie ink. Oh yes, I did apply a bit of pecan pie ink to the pegboard as well to make it look a bit more realistic. I'll just quickly glue this in place. The sentiment again is not mirror image from one side to the other, but it still looks symmetrical because it's similar. Also, the red of the sentiment helps integrate the red of the hammer into the rest of the card. So there's card number 1. All right, card number 2. I again used real red ink and some real red cardstock. I'll talk about these pieces in just a minute. The patterned paper is from a discontinued set called Take to the Sky. You can, of course, use anything you like, but if you want to purchase something similar, you could try the set called Country Woods to give you a nice smoky slate background. I matted the patterned paper with smoky slate, again gutting the cardstock so I could use it elsewhere. I had thought to make several tools from this, but ended up using it mostly for the toolbox handle. I also cut a 1/8 inch strip that I used behind the lower screw holes that weren't covered by the handle. I brought in some smoky slate ink to add a bit of color to the handle. I inked the toolbox itself with real red ink after I embossed it with a folder called Timber 3D. That one is no longer available, but you could use the similar birchwood embossing folder if you wish. So there's my toolbox. Again, I have a 3/4 inch by 4 inch piece of patterned paper for the inside of my card. And I have some pieces that I pre-made, again from the trusty tools, again using real red cardstock and silver foil sheet. I used crumb cake for this pencil, and I stamped this one on white, coloring it with Stamp & Blend markers. I actually stamped that first pencil twice, once on the crumb cake and once on the red. One thing I forgot to mention on this previous card is that the eye finds it more visually pleasing if you have an odd number of objects rather than an even number. Here I have 3 objects. 5 would be fine. 4, there's just a little something less comfortable about that. So that's another thing to think about. Do you have an odd or even number of objects or groupings on your card? Okay, for this card I'm just going to go ahead and quickly glue the background in place. Once again, this card is going to be fairly symmetrical, but not quite as symmetrical as the previous one. I should probably go ahead and talk about this so I can get it out of my way. I used the Everyday Arches die set to cut these 2 pieces, one of basic white and one a little larger of real red cardstock. I used real red ink to stamp Happy Father's Day. This time I used a stamp from Beside Me stamp set. It's a discontinued set, but you can use any sentiment you wish. It doesn't even have to say Happy Father's Day. It could say Happy Birthday, Thank You, whatever you want. The other thing I wanted to talk about as I put this card together is perspective. There can be a bit of a challenge when you start bringing several objects together. For example, this pair of pliers is really a bit big for the toolbox, but it's close enough I think I can get away with it. Similarly, this wrench. It's a bit big, but I think I can get away with it. I thought to bring in a pencil. But if I brought this pencil in, that would be 4 objects, so it's not quite as comfortable. If I really wanted to, I could put the 2 pencils together so that they could visually appear as one object, and I might do that. I do want to make sure none of my tools cover the sentiment. But I wanted to show you this. This measuring tape, compared to the toolbox, is huge, nearly 1/4 the size of the toolbox. The only way to use it in perspective is to push the toolbox back a bit and bring the measuring tape more to the foreground. Anything farther back or up on the page will look farther away, and objects that are farther away will look smaller than the same sized object in the foreground. we could get away with it. But I figured I'd just show it to you and not use it on my card. I also have this set of small things, screw, washer, and nut, that I could toss here in the foreground. You know, I think I'll bring that measuring tape back in. I honestly hadn't expected to use it because of its size, but by moving that toolbox back, I rather like it. And I can move these little things here to this corner. So I'll speed up the video as I glue everything in place, and then I'll be back. I'll just glue around the sides of the toolbox so I can easily tuck my tools in place. And I think I'll put the tape measure on many Stampin' Dimensionals to bring it even farther into the foreground. I think I may just leave the tools loose in the box so they can be removed and looked at. But I'll definitely glue the little screw, etc. to the card. It looks like I need to add a bit of glue to the pencils to hold them in place. They too easily move in front of the sentiment or too far to the side. Okay, my pliers and wrench are still loose and the pencils are glued in place so they don't move where they shouldn't. Oops, I got a touch of glue on the pliers and I need to get rid of that. So that is my second card. I've got 3 little pieces in this lower corner. I've got visually what appears to be 3 pieces here. This sort of makes a large focal piece with a couple more embellishments forming a visual triangle. The card is less symmetrical, but still fairly well balanced, though it might have been better if the pencils were not leaning this way. The red handles of the pliers and the scattering of screw, etc., both help offset the visual weight of the tape measure. Perspective-wise, with the tape measure clearly closer to the viewer, we're getting away with the size of the measuring tape. So that's card number 2. On to card number 3. Again, we're looking at weight and balance. Let me just quickly talk about where these things came from. The paintbrushes are again from the trusty tools. This time I stamped the paintbrush on crumb cake cardstock using pecan pie ink. Then I stamped just the bottom part of the brush with Memento Tuxedo Black ink on basic white cardstock, and with Lost Lagoon ink on top for the paint on the bristles. I used the ivory Stampin' Blend marker to color the bristles and the lightest smoky slate to color the metal portion of the paintbrush. Then fussy cut the pieces and glued them in place on the paintbrush. I made 3 of them exactly the same, again making an odd number of pieces. The greeting is stamped with Lost Lagoon ink on basic white cardstock using a stamp from the same trusty tools set. I used a die from the discontinued Mixed Labels die set to cut it out. Of course, you can again use whatever shape you happen to have. I just glued my cut piece onto a piece of crumb cake cardstock and fussy cut the map for it. So those are the main elements that I have. The patterned paper is from a discontinued set called Serene Love. Again, you can use what you have, but you can get something similar from the Everyday Happiness set that I think may be on last chance now. I took a piece of Lost Lagoon cardstock, the same size as my patterned paper, 4 by 5 1/4, and I inked the edges. Oh yes, I also inked the edges of my patterned paper. After I inked the edges of the cardstock, I started tearing the cardstock into several irregular strips. I decided I'd put one at the top, one at the bottom, and another in between them. I again have an odd number of things, and if you think back to our lesson on the rule of thirds, the card is visually divided into thirds. I think maybe I like this strip a little better for the middle one. Now I'll bring in my paintbrushes and sentiment. Again, I have 3 paintbrushes. I'll put one here, I think I'll move this one down a bit to give a little more room for my sentiment. Okay, I'll have it something like that. I'm going to go off camera and glue it all together and then be right back. Here's the completed card. After gluing the pieces in place on the front, I decided to finish the inside of the card by using not only the small piece of patterned paper, but also one of those torn strips I had left over. So there is card number 3. And here are all 3 of the masculine makes I shared with you today as we talked a bit about visual weight and balance, perspective, and about odd versus even numbers of objects. And now for our close-ups. I hope you've enjoyed today's class. I'd love to hear from you. It helps make the time this takes worthwhile. And please remember to click that thumbs up and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already done so. Have a great day.